Welcome to the Application Delivery How-To video series. My name is William Stoneman, and today we will cover the topic of how to deploy an AVI cluster using vRO. During this video, we will focus on the vRealize Orchestrator workflow. However, this workflow can easily be incorporated into vRealize automation blueprints if required. This workflow is designed to assist with deploying VMware NSX Advanced Load Balancer on the VMware Cloud Foundation. This workflow will also augment implementation as prescribed in the Advanced Load Balancing for VMware Cloud Foundation solution. Before we look at the workflow, let's get an understanding of what is required to successfully deploy an operation-ready AVI controller cluster. An AVI controller cluster can consist of 1 or 3 controller nodes, and in our case, we want to deploy a high availability environment, so we will utilize 3 controller nodes. The first step in this process will be to deploy the controller appliances themselves using the provided OVA templates. When deploying, we will need to specify basic information such as destination, network, storage, VM name, and IP address. Once the controller nodes are up and online, we can start configuring the environment. We will choose a single cluster node as the cluster leader and start the configuration on that node. During the cluster configuration stage, the settings will be propagated to each node. The next steps are to configure a new admin password, configure system configuration parameters such as DNS, NTP, SMTP, and tenant settings. Then configure local or external backup configuration. Once those system settings are configured, we can proceed with the cluster configuration. For this, we will need a cluster name, the node names and IP addresses, as well as the VIP IP address. Finally, once the cluster is configured, the last step is to upload our license file. These steps are very high level, but they illustrate the actions required for us to successfully deploy an AVI cluster. Now, let's take a look at the environment and requirements. In this workflow, we are utilizing the OVF tool commandlet to deploy the controller appliances. This process requires a remote Linux server for us to run SSH commands through. In our lab setup, we are utilizing the vRO appliance itself. To utilize this function, we need to update the following workflow variables with the information for the Linux server. If the local vRO appliance is used, you must specify the IP address or FQDN and not localhost. The variables that need to be updated are SSH username and password, as well as SSH host and SSH port. Next, let's take a look at the input form. I pre-populated with information from my lab to speed things up. The first tab is the VM information, where we specify the vCenter variables where we will be deploying the appliances. The next is the cluster information, where we can specify the IP address for the VIP and the individual nodes. The next is the DNS and NTP configuration. For the NTP configuration, we can specify either IP address or FQDN. Next is the SMTP configuration. We can either specify an SMTP localhost or SMTP server. For the SMTP server, we have to have a remote mail server as well as SMTP server name and password. For our setup, we will be using localhost. Next is the backup configuration, where we can specify either a local backup or a remote SAP backup. For the remote SAP backup, we need to have a remote Linux server as well as username and password. For our setup, we will be using local backup. Next is the licensing configuration. We can specify either an AVI license file or VMware license keys. For the VMware license keys, we can specify multiple license keys. However, for the AVI license file, we can only specify one file. Next, let's run the workflow. The first step is to deploy the appliances. Let's take a look at the vCenter. It might take a few seconds for the tasks to initialize. As you can see, there are 3 deploy OVF template tasks, and the VMs are going into the correct VM folder. Now I will fast forward through the deployment. The appliance has been successfully deployed. Let's head back to the workflow. We now need to wait 5 minutes for the controllers to come online, as after the initial boot, it takes several minutes for the services to come online. Let's fast forward again. The controllers are now online. The next step is to validate that they are healthy. To do this, we use transient REST calls against each of the nodes. As you can see, the status code for each is 200, and they are ready to be configured. The next step is to configure the new admin password, system configuration, and local backup configuration. Then, initialize the cluster. We will now fast forward through this part. The cluster has been initialized and the license file has been uploaded. Now let's take a look at the finished product. Let's log in with our new admin password. Let's take a look at the cluster nodes. As you can see, all three are up and in an active state. Let's take a look at the system configuration. As you can see, the DNS and NTP settings are as specified. The new license file has been uploaded, and the local SMTP setting has been created. Let's take a look at the backup settings. As you can see, the local backup has been set, and the backup passphrase has been set as well. Thank you for watching. Please check out our other exciting videos in our application delivery how-to series.